Hello and welcome. This is a training video on the emotional support of young people. This is part of the Ticket to Life or Ticket to Life program that is going global and is around supporting young people in vulnerable communities from a whole range of backgrounds and experiencing a whole range of difficulties. My name is Jay. I'm a mental health nurse and cognitive behavioural therapist, and I'm also a Scout volunteer, both for WASM but also within the UK as well. We're going to be talking today about the emotional support of youth, and I also, alongside me, I've got Nadine, who's also going to introduce herself.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Nadine. I am a psychologist and psychotherapist working in systemic therapy, both in France at local level and internationally. And I've also been doing various training courses on psychological first aid, also for the Scouts in various global projects. And I'm really happy to share more of that with you today.
Thanks, Nadine. So to start with, what we're going to look at is mental health in general and understanding mental health. And then we're going to be thinking about how to support young people and how to encourage them and nurture them in the environment you're working in. It's important to remember we're speaking about this from a kind of global level, and what you need to be able to do is apply it locally to your own contexts, to what the environment you're working in is. So, for example, if it's a refugee camp, that's a very different scenario to a project with street children, or a project in a community centre in different places across the world. So hopefully this content is helpful and you're able to think about it in the sense of like, what setting am I in, what's my role, and how do I take this and apply it. Okay. Please move, yeah. So first of all, I want to just take a little step back and think about health in general, because we often talk about mental health and emotional health without really considering the broader picture of health. And health is about the mental, physical, and social part of our human self. So we need all these three aspects to be in check for us to consider ourselves to be healthy. The mental, so how we think, feel, and see ourselves and the world around us. The physical, so our physiological, biological self, so the heart pumping, the lungs breathing in and out, that type of stuff. And also the social, so our social sense of community, our sense of safety in our community, the relationships we have. Do we have access to clean water? Do we have shelter? Do we have food? That type of stuff as well. So and all these three areas interact and come together to form health. And there's a lot of overlapping going on. So for example, if your heart beats faster, that's very much a physical thing, but actually it sets off things in our mind, in our thoughts, it makes us feel differently emotionally as well. If you feel anxious, you're likely to feel it in your tummy quite a lot as well. So all these areas overlap and integrate. Okay. So this definition I use quite a lot when delivering mental health first aid, or when I'm delivering, when I'm working with a young person therapeutically. It doesn't really matter on the context. It's just a definition we go to a lot, really. And it's from the World Health Organization. I'll read it out. So mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. Importantly here, it's about everybody having mental health. It's something we experience every day. And just like physical health, every single one of us has mental health. And our mental health shifts up and down over time and day to day. And experiences and life events change our mental health. But we all have a basic sense of mental health. It just depends where we are on that ever-moving continuum in terms of like if we are healthy or we're struggling or we're coping or we're just about managing. Our mental health is always fluctuating. It's about how we think, it's about how we feel, it's about how we behave. So it's about how we think, feel, behave. It's how we see ourselves. So how we value and see ourselves, what we like, what we don't like, how we talk to ourselves as well. Do we encourage and coach ourselves through problems, or do we beat ourselves up and tell ourselves negative things about what we do? It's about something, it's about how we see the world around us. Do we see the world as dangerous? Do we see the world as scary? Do we see the world as an opportunity? Do we see the other people as safe in general? What do we assume about other people? So importantly, it's just making sure that we understand that it's balancing all these different things going on. Really, it's a real complex load of systems that are happening all at the same time. Unless we ever really learn about mental health, it just happens. We don't really necessarily break it down and notice it and think about it an awful lot. I'd invite you at this point just to think about the young people you work with in your specific context or scenario and think, what experiences might they have had that shaped these things? What's their worldview? How do they perceive others? How do they see themselves? What are the experiences that will have shaped those ideas and values and perspectives? Because when we go through a lot of adversity and trauma and difficulty and instability or uncertainty, it shapes the way we think and feel, and it shapes the way we perceive things in the future. So if an event happens, if we've been through all that adversity, how might we see that event differently to an event where somebody maybe hasn't experienced any of that adversity? How might they see things differently? So it's just inviting you to start thinking along these lines and start thinking about the young people you might come across and work with. I just want us to bring it right back to scouting as well and make the point that we already do a huge amount of good things in the world. We are creating a better world. And this is a mission statement from Scouting. The mission of Scouting is to contribute to the education of young people through a value system based on the Scout Promise and Law to help build a better world where people are self-fulfilled as individuals and play a constructive role in society. I'd invite you to think back to the World Health Organization definition of mental health and look at the similarities between that definition of health and mental health and this definition of what we do as Scouts. And there's so many similarities: playing a constructive role, self-fulfillment as individuals, values. You look at the Scout Promise and Law and you can see even more parallels as well. So I think it's important to recognize we already work in this space. We already do a great deal of good when it comes to mental health. So you will do a great deal of good in the roles that you play now in the communities you work in. So these points are very briefly just for you to have as a bit of a reference or a guide, just to say that we know that young people develop in a mentally healthy way. They develop these kind of aspects or in these kind of areas of their life. And we know that young people that go through a huge amount of adversity still grow and develop in these areas. They still form these beliefs and ideas, and they still develop psychologically, emotionally, intellectually. But can we consider perhaps some of the impacts, the adversity and the trauma they may go through, and how that might delay or shape or form some of these ideas, how it might shape their sense of right and wrong potentially, how it may shape their ability and their access to playing and learning, and how it might help them or hinder them when it comes to resolving problems. Perhaps some young people facing adversity may learn at a young age, unfortunately, or too young an age, how to resolve problems that are bigger than them and things that they can't always overcome. Maybe it means that they feel powerless and they feel like they can't overcome any problem because the problems they faced have been out of their control. So can we consider how these experiences and things might shape and change the way they develop? And bringing it right back to Scouting again, to say that we know that Scouting, looking at the evidence, improves and impacts the mental health of young people. We know that if young people are in Scouting, they're less likely to develop a mood disorder over their lifetime. We also know that Scouts develop resilience, and it gives them fosters a sense of belongingness. So you're already doing a great deal of good. And by setting up Scouting or supporting Scouting in the communities that you work in, you're contributing to the resilience and the belongingness and the life outcomes of these young people. So well done and thank you for that. Also just want to make the point that mental health is included in good health and well-being in the part of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So look it up, have a look, see what, as World Scouting, we're working towards when it comes to the SDGs as well. Something else for you to have a little think about is the Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. Now, this is a brilliant little image here from the person on Instagram called Journey to Wellness. I'd recommend them as just a good source of some really beautiful art alongside some solid content. But the idea is that we have basic needs as human beings, with those basic physiological needs right at the bottom there that form the basis of these things. So air, water, food, shelter, safety, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. But we need these building blocks. We need these steps to be able to improve our mental health. We need these steps to feel safe and secure. If you start taking away aspects of these blocks, we're going to see changes in their presentation, in their behavior, in their sense of happiness. It's very hard to have a good sense of mental health if you're hungry, if you're cold, if you've not got enough shelter, if you've not got enough access to water. Likewise, if you don't feel safe at home, feeling emotionally secure is very hard or impossible. So we need to also, while we're thinking about mental health, consider the other needs that people have as humans as well. So before we start moving over towards Nadine's content around psychological first aid and some of the things to consider there, as a Scout volunteer, we need to make sure we stay within some boundaries. And I want you to think about it as like a bit of a continuum, a bit of a spectrum of roles and responsibilities, really. On one hand, of boundaries, we might avoid, dismiss, or deny a need of a young person or a family or somebody we come across. And the other end of this spectrum or continuum is we might overpromise and over-involve and take on too much and ultimately fail the young person because of overstepping those boundaries. So we need to find what our role is as a Scout volunteer within the policies and procedures, and very importantly within safe from harm as well, looking at our Scout policy around safeguarding and safe from harm, and making sure that we stick within those boundaries. We don't avoid a problem, we don't avoid an issue, but equally we don't overstep and overpromise as well. Because in both of those scenarios, if we overstep them or understep in a way, are going to cause the young person potential harm or difficulty or furthering their distress. So before you take on a role, or if you're already in a role, I'd invite you to think about, what is my role? What is my responsibility? What are my limitations? Because when it comes to mental health first aid or psychological first aid, it's essential that we think, actually, even if I'm a therapist, a psychologist, a doctor, if I'm there as a Scout volunteer, I have to act within the boundaries of my role as a Scout volunteer. Even if you were a surgeon and somebody had a heart attack in the middle of town, in the middle of a street, you wouldn't suddenly start performing open heart surgery on that person in the middle of the street. You'd be a first aider. You would do the first aid steps. You'd call 911 or 999 or whatever it is, and you'd go through the first aid steps. It's exactly the same when it comes to psychological or mental health first aid. We need to think, what's my role? What's my responsibility? What's the appropriate response right now? Even if I've got loads of skill, I can use some of it, but to a point. So that's something I'd really encourage you to think about and reflect on, both yourself, but also as part of your team as well. I'm going to hand back over to Nadine now to talk through some further content before we come back together for a bit more of a discussion.
Wow, thank you, Jay. There was about 1,000 things where I was like feeling like, oh, I would love to discuss this further, or yes, that so relates to something I could have said. So thank you for that. Maybe I can just jump on the very last point that you mentioned, because it's essential, I think, to not get lost in roles. And we are many things. We are everywhere we go. We are family members, we are sisters, and we are, I mean, in my case, daughters or parents or friends or professionals or volunteers, and sometimes that gets very confusing because we are not roboters. And when you're a Scout volunteer, obviously you're not just a Scout volunteer, you also are, but you bring your own values, your own beliefs, the things that you feel are important. And the way we often formulate it in therapy is talking about mandate. So saying, what is my mandate? Do I have a mandate to intervene? Even if I have fabulous ideas of what would be good for someone else, let's check if that belongs to me, if this is really something I was asked for. And maybe that's the jump to psychological first aid, because here mandate is important as well. Um, the concept of psychological first aid is, I would say, fortunately growing in the past years, is something that is becoming more known, or that more and more people are becoming aware of. And if you think of physiological first aid, maybe most of you, I don't know if every scout has to be trained in first aid, if there's something like that. In certain countries, like in Germany, first aid training is part of your driver's license course. So you have to do it. It's compulsory. In others, it's not. But I think for everyone, it's quite clear that you don't need to be a medical doctor or a surgeon to provide first aid. So people kind of have a feeling of, if I can intervene until the professionals arrive, if I have those very first gestures I can do, that may save lives. And so that's perfectly fine for anyone to learn. Strangely enough, we realize that when it comes to psychological first aid, there is a form of taboo in society, something where people very often say, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not going there. And that is really a pity. And this is also why we're doing psychological first aid, to say, in the same way, if you can recognize that someone is in acute stress or in panic or going through trauma, those very first simple interventions that you can do to calm down the person and to bring them back will have a long-term effect on people, even if you're not, or just because in that case you're not providing therapy, you're providing those gestures. So it's a little bit about this that I'd like to tell you, with simple tools, ideas that you can bring in when you're working with human beings, or supporting human beings, or accompanying human beings, and with a special focus on youth. Um, Now, the rule number one in all of this is, and this is not selfishness, this is a survival rule, first check where you are. Okay. If I try to help someone or to support someone in a massive stress situation, and if I'm overly stressed, it could be that we're both not super efficient. So, rule number one, when you're in a plane, when we used to take planes back then, they would say, in case of emergency, the oxygen mask is going to fall down. And the rule is always, please put your mask on before you put it on someone else. Being a mother, I find that's quite difficult, because I always think, of course, I would put the mask on my daughters first, but that's a mistake. If I don't put mine on, I may not be able to put it to anyone else anymore. So when you're a volunteer, when you're working with other people, you have a social responsibility to check regularly, am I okay? Are my physiological needs, mental needs, security needs, the whole Maslow pyramid needs okay? Am I okay? So that I have the energy to support other people. Now, this model, you may know, for those of you who have done various intercultural courses, it's quite famous in outdoor training, etc. So Karl Hohnke is an outdoor trainer, and we've readapted that model to talk a little bit about mental health and about trauma. So if you look back at the yellow little dot in the middle, that's the so-called comfort zone. We all have comfort zones. And I'll let you try to connect with what makes your comfort zone a comfort zone. All the things that make you feel good. All the things where the comfort zone is a zone where we don't need to make efforts. We don't need to learn. We don't need to adapt. We can just be, being the way you are. Okay? And I cannot say this is or this is not comfort zone, because comfort zone is very personal. I'm sure Jay and I wouldn't have a, completely common idea of what a comfort zone is. Go. So sometimes it could be my little rituals, things that I'm used to doing every day. The language I speak could be my comfort zone, my family, my friends, places, my home, um, beliefs, all these things that make me feel good where I am. Okay. And one thing I would already like you to really consider is we cannot force other people to feel comfortable in our comfort zone. So to always be in a position of, I don't know. I don't know. It's good for me, but maybe it's not for the other person. So I keep in a position like children do. I wonder and I ask questions and I check because I don't know. And the moment I start doing assumptions and I'm not curious anymore, I may make mistakes. I learned this from one of the unaccompanied minors I worked with, Ahmed, to whom I said, hey, Ahmed, maybe you could think of a really calm place, something that is calm and silent. You know, my assumption that silence and calmness belongs to a comfort zone. My assumption. Ahmed, coming from a war zone, immediately said to me, no, 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 no. Silence is the moment before bombing. Silence is not comfort. Comfort is when you're in a big market with many people and children laughing and screams and music. Okay? I cannot assume I know. Now, when you get out of comfort zone, things we do on daily basis is adapting. Human beings are really good at adapting. We are super good at resilience and adapting. So we can get out of our comfort zone, and this is also called the stretching zone, is also called learning zone. That's the zone where we do things differently because you know the way I usually take to work is blocked, so I take another one. I think we've all been very good in stretching zone in the past year. The world has somehow changed a bit, so we've had to readapt quite a bit. And hey, who would have told us 2 years ago we'd all be running around wearing masks? We would have probably found that crazy. It works pretty well in general. So here you go. And again, the stretching zone is not something fixed. It is the zone where we are making efforts, we are learning, but it stays manageable. We are still okay. We can deal with it. Less comfortable in comfort zone, but okay. Where it becomes complicated is when we fall out of the comfort zone, of the stretching zone, and we get into panic zone. And this is where psychological first aid comes in. Panic zone is the moment where it's like if your brain was going on ice. It's freezing. You are not able anymore to cognitively reflect. It is your body that is completely taking over. Okay? It's like physiological reactions. Okay? And we'll get there later. These physiological reactions are super useful. Okay? Because they allow me to quickly react to events. So it's good, it's useful. It's not comfortable. And it's useful when there's a good reason to be in that situation, but sometimes there's not even an evident reason. And what I'd really like to transmit today is we don't need to know or to understand what puts someone else in a panic zone. We don't need the content. We don't need a crunchy story. What we need is to recognize that someone is in panic zone and to be able to bring them back into stretching or comfort zone. When I say crunchy stories, Steve DeShazer, who's a famous systemic therapist, he used to say, if you are fascinated by crunchy stories, then read police stories or read thrillers. Leave people alone. Okay. So, all this being said, when you recognize someone in panic zone, don't ask them what happened. Don't ask them to explain. Try to unlearn those beautiful little stupid sentences we all use, I include myself, such as calm down. I would if I could. Or it's nothing. Children who hurt themselves, who are in panic zone, when we tell them that's nothing, that's apparently not nothing for the child that's going through. So even if I can't empathize, I try to bring the person back. And where I want to get with this model is that scouting, in my little experience with scouting, is a lot about recreating comfort zones. Also learning but a lot about recreating comfort zones. And especially when we talk about vulnerable youth. Um, if you think back of all the things I said about comfort zones, um, home, language, culture, rituals, for many people, for example, refugees or unaccompanied minors I work a lot with, all of that has suddenly disappeared. None of that is left. And we cannot recreate the same comfort zones, but we can create small comfort zones in the here and now. And scouting is clearly one of those. When the Greek scouts were very active on Lesbos, when all the refugees were arriving, I found this story fascinating to say that some of the Syrians arriving had an immediate recognition when seeing the Greek scouts by saying, "Hey, I'm a scout in Syria." And how that feeling of absolute chaos, mess, they left their home, they left a war zone, they are, and there's something here. There's a scout here. There's something like coming home and belonging and being able to be part of something. So that's important. Comfort zones are small things when everything is chaotic around. After 9/11, there was a study where 800 people, survivors of the terror attacks, were asked what was the most helpful straight after the terror attack. And about 60% of people who were asked answered the glass of water or the coffee I was offered. Okay. Now, this is not about drinking because most of them never actually got a glass of water or a coffee. It's about the fact that the brain was connected to normality when everything else is breaking down. Isn't that amazing? As simple as that. Offer a glass of water or coffee. Or if someone is smoking, then have a cigarette with them if they're having one. But it's not the moment to start saying this is not healthy. That's another thing. So little comfort zones. I'll stop with a little anecdote on this model. A good friend of mine 3 years ago had her house burned down overnight. So there was a fire and they were evacuated in the middle of the night and nobody was injured, but they literally lost everything there. Their house burned down. And I saw her the next morning. She was telling me under shock. And I said, "Do you have time to come for a coffee?" So she came home for a coffee and I asked her, "What's the worst?" And she said, "Well, the worst is tomorrow. It's my daughter's birthday and I can't bake a cake for school." The house burned down. There's nothing left. And the worst is the cake for school. Why is that? Because the rest is too big for our brain to actually deal with it. The cake is something she can deal with. Normality, comfort zone. So what I said is, "Hey, how about my daughters and I bake cakes this afternoon?" We baked cakes. We didn't find her a new home. We didn't buy furniture. We baked a cake. And years after, every time I see her, she says, "Oh my God, those cakes you bake, you cannot imagine how important." So I'm not saying you should all start now baking cakes for your for your scouting activity. I'm saying look for the little comfort zones. And that can even be I'm coming every Wednesday from 2 to 4. Rituals, routine, things that make it predictable. Okay? With time, our zones tend to grow. So what used to be a panic zone can also become a stretching zone or a comfort zone after a while. Humans are super flexible. We learn and we develop new ways of dealing with situations. And one thing is sure, the more trauma someone has, the more resources someone has. Might be a strange way of looking at it, but if you're still alive with all the shit you went through, then you surely have a big, big package of resources. Okay for that one? Now we can move on to the next slide. Great. I'll try to be short because I get very passionate about this. Very shortly, another way of presenting it and showing you what happens in the body. So the window of tolerance, if you see the two black lines, that's the window of tolerance. That is the zone in which life is manageable. In other words, the window of tolerance is both my comfort and my stretching zone together. When I'm at the limits, I'd rather stretching, and otherwise I'm in my comfort zone. Again, the more tired, the more stressed, the more overworked I am, the smaller my comfort zone, my window. Okay, so one of the first things to do in psychological first aid for oneself is to keep taking care of my window of tolerance, to have daily little routines, exercises, or just lifestyles that make sure my window of tolerance remains broad enough so I don't fall out of it. When we have an unexpected event, event X, our body, I said before, panic zone, the body takes over. There's three ways of taking over of the body. The first one is what we call over-arousal or overactivation. And here we are exactly like animals. Archaic modes of survival, we go into fight or flight. Okay, so my body will, within half a second or even less, measure what can I do to get out of that situation. If I'm driving my car and a car suddenly comes from the side, I don't have time to make up a cognitive strategy. It will be too late. So it's brilliant. My body's doing it and probably braking or turning the wheel or doing something quick. That's a fight or flight modus. What happens in the body here is you get redder in the face, the heartbeat is quicker, the breath is short and quick, sweating, trembling, the eyes go in all directions. When you see that happening in someone, you have good indications that someone is in over arousal. Okay, useful when it comes to surviving. A third strategy, when this is not possible, is the also called playing dead, underactivation. The body does the opposite. So it goes into minimum survival mode, just what is needed to. The opossum, for example, is an absolute champion in this in Australia. Yeah, not so good in fight or flight. The opossum plays dead. You really think that animal is dead. And when the danger is over, he keeps going. Okay. Again, these mechanisms are very useful for surviving. So when there is a danger, it's good to let them happen. I just want to give you a very concrete example here again on underactivation. I've been working for a few years regularly on the island of Utøya in Norway, which is the island where the terrorist attack of Breivik, an extreme right-wing terrorist, happened in 2011, and there was actually a youth camp on the island at that moment with many victims. And among other things, we've also been working with some young people who were on the island and survived. And it's fascinating to hear that many of them describe exactly this, that their body went into underactivation, couldn't move anymore. They were even themselves not so sure whether they were still alive or not, so that the terrorist wasn't able to realize where he had shot and where he hadn't. Okay, so what I'm saying here is this is not cognitive strategy. They were not saying, I'm going to pretend I'm dead. This is something the body does, and the body does really well to make us survive. So far, if there's bombing, run. It's a good idea. We're not doing first aid. When we come to the next slide, which is exactly the same, but here, if you see there's not an event anymore, there's what we call triggers. Triggers are more complex because they mean there's kind of a programming mistake in my brain. I've been through an event that was traumatic some time ago or many, many years ago. And something here and now, I'm sitting here having a nice conversation, and something reminds my body of the undigested event of the past. It could be a color, a smell, a movement, the voice of someone, a place, anything reminds my body or connects my body or my brain to the event. And my body suddenly reacts in survival mode, so goes into over or under activation in the same way. Okay, and everyone around is going to think, what is happening now? That is really odd way of, behaving. And here is my invitation to you. If you see that happening, first of all, don't question what happened. Recognize that there is a body reaction, either up, becoming red in the face, trembling, sweating, heartbeat, breath, or the opposite, becoming pale, having the body completely closing down, being all loose, and a very heavy breath. When you recognize this, that's the moment to do psychological first aid, to bring the person back into the window of tolerance. And then it stops. Yes. When you do physiological first aid, you bring the person into stable lateral position, and then you stop and you wait for the emergency to come. Same here. Once the person is back into their window of tolerance, their brain is again able to cognitively reflect and find solutions, and the first aid as such stops. Very little example here for the triggers of the overactivation. So I said I work with unaccompanied minors, and sometimes this is important. The people who are overactivated, the loud ones, when there's an emergency, you hear them. They scream for help. They all agitated. They move. Okay, so they're the ones who become the first response aid. The underactivated ones are the quiet ones. They don't move. So we often forget them. So please be attentive to that type of body reaction. It's not just a young person being cool. It's a young person who's possibly really stuck in their body. It's not a nice feeling. It's quite a horrible one. So I worked with one boy, Abdallah, in Germany in a refugee home shelter. And he came late from school one afternoon because his school had lasted longer. It was 3 p.m. And he said, "I'm hungry." And the educator said, no, you're late. So there's not going to be any lunch. Dinner is at 7. And he repeated, "I'm hungry." And she said, "Yeah, you're late. Sorry, dinner is at 7. And within half a second, it was like a volcano coming up, Abdullah. And he broke 200 glasses and plates in the kitchen. It was a massive body reaction. Okay, it was a survival reaction that obviously was completely inappropriate in that situation, because cognitively Abdullah know that tonight he's going to get some dinner. Yes, but his body didn't know. And when you know that Abdullah spent 9 months stuck in a container in Libya with food and light deprivation, when his body heard you're not getting any food now, his body went into survival mode, into fight or flight. Okay. And what happens there is when it comes back down, because that is too late to intervene. In that case, it's the same rule than in safe, make sure you're safe and other young people are safe. But when he comes back down, what adds on to it is terrible feelings of shame, feeling really embarrassed, plus all the material stuff. He has to pay it back to work. And he's really suffered in his body. Now, this is not someone being violent or someone being rude or socially inappropriate. This is someone who shows signs of trauma. And what we can do is, first of all, show them that model. Say, "Hey, look, you're not crazy. This is something happening in your body." And secondly, say, "Do you want me to show you 1 or 2 activities you could do yourselves to calm down when you feel it?" Okay. And there's a whole bunch of activities you can do. But one rule here is what you do is physiological. We calm down the body, not the brain. It's not about talking. It's about calming down the body. When the body is calm, then you can have a chat again. The most powerful activity here, because this is not a long day training, so I can't show you, but is to actually take a person who's overactivated and tell them, "Come with me, go to a wall, and push the wall with all your strength." Just tell them, "Push the wall," and I push with you. And you keep pushing, as if we wanted to move that wall 10 centimeters back. What we're doing is using all this body energy without harming anyone, and telling the person it's okay that it's there. The wall is stable, and we're going to push it until the muscle tonus kind of comes back down. And the person, you will see a big breath, and you know the person is back in their window of tolerance. And very often they will tell you, "Oh, wow, that was really tough." Yeah. Okay. So we stop telling people to calm down because they can't. It's bigger than them. We actually tell them that it's okay to have that energy. In the same way, go for a walk. And it can be quick walking in the beginning. Walk with them. Let them use the energy, and then slowly start walking slowlier from your side, so that It's pacing and leading until the body is calm. Okay. Let them use the energy. In other words, a person in that situation is like with the 2 feet back somewhere else in the past, in an event that hasn't been digested. Anything physiological you do is to bring the person back in the here and now in their body. There's different activities also coming from the hypno world. For example, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That is an exercise about what do you see, what do you hear, what do you feel in your body. We've put in the PowerPoint a few links to those exercises, also breathing exercises that can be some ideas of how you can do this. These are all things you can do with a person in over arousal. And someone who's under aroused, you basically need, just like in physiological first aid, if you ask them, can you hear me? And they don't respond, their eyes are opened, you know they stuck in their body. And you're just going to tell them, I'm going to grab your arm and pull you up. You take them out of this. And then you walk with them until life comes back into their body. That's very, very brief now in many things, but just some ideas here of what you can do. And all of this works even if you don't speak the person's language. That may be important for some of you. It doesn't matter. Your voice, if you say things in a calm way, is calming. And anything you ask the other person to do, you do yourself. So you're using your mirror neurons, you're using your body to accompany a person. All of that after having checked that you are in your window of tolerance, obviously. Very quickly, my last slide. And then, sorry, I think I'm completely over time here. Okay, that's a summary basically. So don't be fascinated by stories. Don't ask them to calm down. Don't ask them what happened. Don't touch someone who's over or underactivated. We don't know what has triggered them. So we touch the least we can. The only thing, as I said, is the upper arm in underactivation, but you say it before you do it. Never put your hands anywhere else. Don't make assumptions about why. We don't know. Don't judge a person. Don't say, see how they behave. They are violent. They are this, they are that. And don't focus on the trauma, on the story. Okay? What do you do instead? Check your own needs and calmness. Make yourself super predictable. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to go and get a tissue. I'm going to do this and that. Don't make some movements that you haven't predicted. Create small comfort zones in the here and now. Bring back the person through grounding and breathing exercises. And focus rather on resources and survival skills. How did you manage? Rather than asking someone what happened in Syria, ask them, how did you manage to survive this? Tell me about your resources. A person is not just the label, okay? A street child is not just a street child. A refugee is not just a refugee. How limiting is that of a definition of a person? Ask them to tell you about what else they are. Tell me about you being a child. Tell me about what you like to play. Tell me about how you actually managed to go through life with all of that. This is what I want to know. Be interested in the person, not in their traumatic story. I think I'll stop here. The next slide is just about links to resources. So maybe we still have a little bit of time, Jay, to exchange about all this. Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so wonderful, Nadine. Thank you so much. It's such incredible advice and guidance, as well as thinking about some experiences and lived experiences that you've had, and the privileges that you've had working with these young people that have gone through those experiences, and how we can learn from them. I think the next step really was just to bring up some of the themes and some of the challenges that you may come across as a volunteer or working with young people as part of the Ticket to Life program, and thinking about these key things around risk to self, risk to themselves, risk from other people as well as something else we need to consider when it comes to safe from harm. And thinking about self-harm, so coping with distress by harming themselves might be a theme that comes up for young people you work with. And there's also a risk around suicide as well, in terms of people that take their own life. And it's very important that we consider our own needs and consider our own mental health at this point, but also thinking about the judgments and the values that we have around this topic, and thinking actually judgment and assumption about somebody that may be thinking of suicide is never helpful. Those taboos and those assumptions always get in the way rather than help. So thinking about those do's and don'ts that Nadine's already talked about and applying that to suicide is really important, as well as also the postvention. So what do we do in the event of somebody dying by suicide? And this is another topic that we need to consider, that we've signposted to. Nadine's also talked very well around trauma. We also know that drug and alcohol use or misuse can be a big theme for people that have experienced trauma, or perhaps are currently accessing drugs and alcohol as a way of coping. And our judgments there need to be really careful and considered too. We all cope in healthy and unhelpful ways. And sometimes our ways of coping can become quite problematic. Sometimes even seemingly healthy coping can become unhealthy over time if we do it too much. So it's important that we consider, how am I coping? How is this young person coping? How do we make sure we keep them safe from themselves, but also from other people too? So these are some of the key themes that we've signposted to, which each one of these we could spend a day talking you on. So it's a bit like, well, what do we include? What don't we include? The reality is all of those things are things you could spend days learning about, really. But we've hopefully covered quite a few themes in the resources and as part of the Ticket to Life program as well.
If I can, Jay, I like the word coping and the way you presented it. For me, the solution-focused approach is really useful in dealing with those topics, because what I always try to keep in mind is whatever the person does is already the best solution the person has found so far. So whether it's drug abuse or alcohol abuse or self-harm, this is already a trial to cope or to find a solution. And nobody sees that because it's not adapted. It's not the right one. It's not good enough. So nobody sees the efforts that a person is making in surviving in certain situations. And I was trained by a Belgian psychiatrist, Luc Isebaert, who really developed solution-focused approach in Europe. And he used to work with people with an alcohol addiction. And when people came and said, I failed again, I drank that one bottle within a week, Luc would ask, how did you manage not to drink more? Because what he considered was, there was that one time, but there's been all the efforts the rest of the week to try and not do it. And nobody sees it because the person is limited to that one failure. And I think when you work with vulnerable youth, it's important to also, again, look at the resources and all the amazing efforts they are being made for sticking into the norm.
And it's that negativity bias that we have as well, isn't it? We're always looking for the risk, we're always looking for the danger, we're also always looking for the negative. When actually, as volunteers, perhaps coming into that scenario, in that circumstance, we need to really identify with everything we can see that we like and that's good. Because often anybody will find the negatives first, especially if you've gone through adversity and gone through what you might perceive as failing to cope with the situation, when actually, if we look at it, you've coped very well considering what you've gone through. And if we can reframe that and, like you say, see it in a more solution-focused way, I think that can be really helpful. But the other thing around this is the fact that young people will probably already telling themselves that they've something negative about themselves. They probably believe a lot of negative things about themselves or the world. We don't need to add to that. So our judgments are never going to be helpful. Nobody ever receives judgment and goes, brilliant, yeah, that's a really good turning point. It just doesn't work like that. So there will be things that they're doing to cope well. There will be things that they're doing that's brilliant and wonderful and making sense of the world in their own way. So trying to highlight those things to them whilst not focusing on the negatives of a negative behavior, for example, or a negative aspect of their coping. I think it's key to this. Yeah. So coming towards a summary then, and starting to wrap up, I don't know, Nadine, if you had any final words to say. I suppose if I hand back over to yourself in a few seconds, I'd just like to say thank you to the volunteers that are hopefully watching this at some point in the future. We don't quite know who's going to be watching it, but thank you for what you already do. You are making a difference to the young people that you work with already. And we hope that this sort of content is helpful to progressing that even further. But always go back to your scouting values and your scouting lessons that you've learned, and what you bring to this from outside of scouting as well, because there will be lessons and things that you can also support yourself as a first aider with. What have you found helpful in the past? What experiences and learning have you taken from other things that have happened that you can bring to this role already? So thank you for what you're already doing. And I'm sure Nadine and myself would be very pleased to add further content or signpost people if that's something people are interested in. So do reach out.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that as well. Just, drop an email, ask us. I'm always happy to we probably won't have the answers, but we're always happy. I mean, I don't, maybe you do, Jay, but I won't. But, happy to think together, to put our brains and hearts and hands together and reflect on these super complex topics, because it's all about human beings. So.
Wonderful. And look after yourself, like Nadine said about that the oxygen mask, we need to put it on first before anyone else's. So look after yourselves as volunteers going forward. So thank you very much for today, and all the very best for your future endeavours and future efforts supporting young people around the world. Thank you.
Take care, and thank you, Jay, for this wonderful exchange and dialogue.